The assigned text, which is a speech in praise of Helen, was written by Gorgias, perhaps the most famous of all the early Greek public speaking teachers, known to us as the Sophists. In order to better grasp what is going on in this text, it is helpful to know a bit more about Gorgias, about the Sophists more generally, and also about Helen, who is the subject of this text. So first, who is Gorgias? We don't know much about him, but we do know that he was an important educator who lived between 480 and 380 before the Common Era, born on the island of Sicily and spending much of his career traveling from one Greek city-state to the other, teaching rhetoric. From the fragments of his writings that have come down to us, we know that he taught a number of doctrines that were consistent with the sophistical movement more generally. He taught, first of all, that we can have only probable or provisional knowledge of the world. We can't, in other words, know anything in an absolute or universally true way. It's not that there is no truth, it's rather that there are many partial and culturally particular truths. Secondly, there is no accessible essence or actual truth that transcends this provisional knowledge that we do have. We are stuck with and in the partial and probable forms of knowledge that we have. Although we can certainly encounter alternative forms of knowledge to our own, which call our forms into crisis or at least qualify them. We can have cross-cultural experiences, in other words, where we are able to see or understand the world from the perspective of someone who grew up in a different place and who learned different ways of thinking about the world than we have, and whose experiences have produced a different sense about how things are. Thirdly, what we are left with then is persuasion. Eloquence that helps us forget what we do not know. Eloquence that helps us forget the provisionality of our knowledge. Eloquence that helps us live our lives, defend ourselves in court, advance policies in the public assembly, and to make decisions about truth or justice in a changing and provisional context. So Gorgias believed that that speech and eloquence are a practice of power, almost like magical incantations. Speech has the power to make people do things they would not otherwise do. That's why in Helen's defense, Gorgias argues that if she was persuaded to go with Paris to Troy, she cannot be held accountable since words made her do it. And we'll come back to this point in a moment. So those are some things that Gorgias is known to have believed about the relationship between speech and knowledge. How does this fit into the broader school of sophistry, or the Sophists? We know that the Sophists were public speaking teachers who educated Greek citizens in how to conduct themselves in a democratic society. Their educational philosophy was focused around speaking and acting well in the world, speaking and discussing anything and everything, and speaking and discussing all sides of a question or topic of knowledge. This is how one can come to know. A number of very specific practices of speech are associated with the Sophists and their training schools. The Sophists were committed to always presenting at least two sides to questions. While we don't have access to absolute truth, we are more likely to be fair and just if we are always attentive to both sides. From the Sophists, we get the idea of playing devil's advocate, of taking up an argument just to try it out, to see if it works, or to test someone else's argument. The reading assignment for next Tuesday, the Disologoi, illustrates this devil's advocate, or two sides of an argument. The Sophists were always engaged in practices that help to make the weaker argument stronger. Look for that unconventional wisdom that's out there, what a minority of people believe, that which is considered perhaps foolish by the majority, which doesn't poll very high in opinion polls, and see what is required to take that weak argument and to make it more powerful than the currently strong arguments? In order, let's reverse. What is required for us to reverse the evaluation of what counts as true and not true? The speech on Helen that you're reading for this assignment can be seen as an example of this, making the weaker argument stronger. If a dominant view is that Helen played some role, had some blame, shared some blame for the Trojan War, Gorgias is trying to show that she had nothing to do with it. That's an argument that would have been a challenge to make. It would have been the weaker argument in that context. Closely connected with always arguing two sides and always trying to take up the weaker argument, the Sophists turned public speaking events into competitions, sort of grand spectacles, similar to athletic events, in which you had crowds cheering for two different sides, and this idea that someone is going to win the debate or is going to win the speech competition and someone is going to lose. And in this context, there are heroes like Gorgias who are particularly good at winning and whose students are particularly good at winning. And so it's a way of turning speech into an athletic competition. And this competitive aspect helps people craft stronger and stronger arguments. An interesting story comes down to us about Gorgias's teachers, Corax and Tisias, some of the earliest sophistical orators and teachers. That kind of illustrates the culture of sophistic training. The story is that Corax was Tisias's teacher, and Tisias at some point refused to pay for his training, and so Corax, the teacher, sued the student Tisias for non-payment of his student fees. And Corax's argument was, I've clearly taught Tisias very well, and so he should pay me the amount that he owes me. And if I win this case, he obviously should pay me. But if I lose the case, he should also pay me, because I've obviously trained him so well that I've lost the argument. Tisias had a comeback to this. His argument is, really, Corax taught me nothing about persuasion and rhetoric, and so I shouldn't have to pay. And if I win this case in the court, then I obviously don't have to pay. But if I lose the case, I should obviously also not have to pay, because I wasn't taught well. The fact that I didn't win proves that I wasn't taught what I need to know. The story goes that the judge ended up siding with Corax, saying that from a bad crow comes a bad egg. And Corax actually in the Greek means crow. We could perhaps talk in class on Tuesday about what we learn about rhetoric, or at least sophistical rhetoric, from this interesting story. So, coming back to the speech that we're reading about Helen. Who was Helen? Well, to make a long story short, Helen was a beautiful woman in Greek mythology, the wife of the king of Sparta, Menelaus. Helen was abducted from Sparta by Prince Paris of Troy, taken back to Troy. And this abduction was regarded as the cause of the Trojan War in Greek mythology. Helen's beauty is in this story both a powerful and iconic force. Helen becomes a kind of symbol for Greek identity, a bit like Lady Liberty or the Statue of Liberty or Uncle Sam in the United States. The long and bloody conflict between the Greek allies of Sparta on the one hand and Troy on the other, this battle is at the center of Homer's Iliad. And in this work, the Iliad, and in others that represent Helen, there is a kind of ambiguity about whether Helen was abducted or whether she was seduced. This ambiguity is connected with the contradictory way in which Helen was regarded in Greek culture and mythology. On the one hand, she's the most beautiful woman in the world, whose beauty brought the Greeks together to fight this heroic war. And at the same time, a woman whose beauty and actions were connected to so much sacrifice, death, and conflict, dividing the Trojans from the rest of the Greeks. In the Iliad, Helen is shown to blame herself for the war. She regrets having come with Paris to Troy. It appears that Gorgias, in his speech, is trying to remove all possible blame of Helen, even the blame that she heaps upon herself in the classic mythology. We'll see in the speech that Gorgias argues there are 4 possible motivations for Helen to go to Troy with Paris, and in none of these cases is she to blame. First, he argues it could have been the gods that decided that she needed to go to Troy, in which case, if the gods decide something, it's not your fault if you do it. It could be, on the other hand, that she was abducted by Paris. Again, it's not her fault. She was abducted. Thirdly, it could be the case that she was persuaded by Paris's eloquence. In Gorgias' argument, she's not to blame in this case either. Gorgias talks about how words are such a powerful force that we can't hold people accountable for what the words make us do. Fourthly, Gorgias says it could be that she just fell in love with Paris, and we can't blame people because of the things that we do for love, right? So those are the 4 main arguments there that Gorgias raises about why we shouldn't hold Helen accountable for the Trojan War. There are a few questions I'd like to close with to think about as you read the text. These might be questions for us to discuss on Tuesday. First of all, do you agree that words have this kind of magical power that Gorgias ascribes to them, power to make us do what we would otherwise not do? And can you think of examples of where people have been persuaded to do something that they would otherwise not do or should not do? How should we be held accountable for actions done in response to eloquence? In Nazi Germany, for example, were the German people responsible for what they did because of the eloquence of Hitler's rhetoric? Are we responsible for credit card debt that we run up because of easy credit and the eloquent power of advertisements and consumer culture? So that's one question. What do we make of this power of language and power of words over our lives and actions? We could also ask about love. Are we responsible for what we do for love? What role does love play in our knowledge of the world? Does love help us know the world, or does it undermine our knowledge of the world? Does loving someone or something help us to know it better or less so? Finally, in this speech, Helen is portrayed as a victim of circumstance. No matter what happened, she becomes completely passive in this account. Unlike in Homer's Iliad, for example, where Helen speaks at least a few times and acknowledges her guilt and talks about her feelings, here Helen does not speak at all. So has Gorgias helped or hurt Helen's reputation with this speech that denies all moral responsibility to Helen? What role does gender play in the way that Helen is characterized here? Would Gorgias likely have made this kind of argument if he was trying to rescue a man from blame? There are many other questions and issues to discuss about this intriguing text. Please do take the time to enjoy it, and I look forward to seeing what you have to say about it on Thursday.